Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for our last session before the summer break. We've got two subjects tonight, which are not really related at all, but both are really interesting. And I'm hoping we're going to have an interesting discussion around it. And they're both issues that I personally have a lot to learn about. So I'm looking forward to both of them. So the first session, the first subject, I should say, is acid communism. A phrase actually that I hadn't come across much, but Paul Cooper has told me a lot about it. So I'm very glad he can join us tonight. He's not going to show his face on video, but we're going to show some pictures while he is talking. So fire away, comrade. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tina. I'll just start by talking a bit about Mark Fisher and some of the key concepts that are associated with acid communism, if you like, as a concept. I'll start by saying a little bit about myself, because acid communism is in part associated with the online left, especially younger people. There's their first point of contact with the left, with socialist ideas, is often online these days, whether we like it or not. My own background, I'm not a young person, is as an activist on terra firma, and I've been involved variously with Marxist groups as a union organizer, community activist, and to a modest degree in aspects of cultural activism. So I'm coming to politics with a legacy of, meetings in rooms above pubs, Saturday morning paper sales, demos, and real time physical engagement, which remains important. As I said, I'm associated with the Acid Communism Facebook page, which is looking to branch out. It has 55,000 followers. At times it has phenomenal reach, in the millions. That's not to say anything about it either way, but I mean, this is the kind of audience that can be generated. So, and we've made various connections through that with different groups, different projects. There's a techno communist DJ collective. There've been various artists, as well as a large number of activists who are either coming into, young people coming into political activism, or those not exiting it or retreating from it. I'm certainly not as active on the streets as I once was. A purely online left, of course, is impossible and doomed to fail. But an effective new working class movement, new meaningful aggregations of Marxists organizing parties and projects cannot ignore these spaces. And I think we can tell a lot about the coherence and the future viability of some left-wing groups whose online presence is laughable, to say the least, including some of the groups with four-figure memberships. You'd think within these groups there'd be a more imaginative approach, and I think this raises questions about the left in an era of defeat, and what we do is if you like, as Mark Fisher called it, a provocation as well as a promise. Acid communism, that is. I'm a supporter of the Weekly Worker, CPGB. I'm in favour of the party form, orthodox Marxism, traditional forms of work or organising. So I wouldn't contrast some cultural movement, experimentation, innovation, borrowing from other tendencies, even as in conflict with that. I'd see the entire left experience, the entire working class experience, if you like, as a data of experience. Mark Fisher personally had a massive impression on me, being the same age, coming from the same kind of background, same music tastes, and same politics brought in that area that sort of spanned, the big struggles of the 1980s to the collapse of the Berlin Wall, collapse of the Soviet Union, so on and so forth, and the effect that had, which is important to realise. So I want to try and outline Mark Fisher, the person, who he was, his location in time, his background, from a very working class background that, emerged into academia, which is quite highly thought of, and has quite a following amongst a range of people on the left and beyond. Capitalist Realism, his book, is being widely read, widely quoted, and so on. And Capitalist Realism itself is a flip, of course, on socialist realism, which was the art movement, the arts tendency, if you like, within official communism in the Soviet Union. So you have in 1917, you have the revolution, an upsurge in art, in innovations, in forms of communicating ideas. And with the defeat of 1917, that's thrown out the window, and you get people standing in front of trains and all that kind of thing, very conservative forms of art. So it's calling it capitalist realism on the basis that the capitalism has a new orthodoxy, things that aren't questions, which comes from somewhere else. As I said, Acid Communism is the title book of his posthumous book. He was beginning to write a book before he died. He committed suicide in 2017, ironically, 100 years after 1917. I thought of that before. So acid communism, of course, these concepts come out in the early 2009. The book Capitalist Realism was written, and acid communism is more recent. And we've just come out of a period, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where official media has gone into overdrive about how socialism or communism are outdated concepts. Trade unions doing anything is militant madness, and so on and so forth. And it's certainly been viewed by a generation, maybe the generation that came after me, people in their late 30s, 40s now, were exposed to a barrage of pro-capitalist propaganda, where challenging that seemed impossible. And acid communism is a phrase that opens up different possibilities. It's a kind of, it's not the kind of regimented dogmatism that, unfairly in many respects, the left is often portrayed as. There are themes of collective joy that Mark explored, rave culture, and its subsequent commodification of dance music, football. He talks about in terms of its increasing commodification. Increasingly, you have a situation where, and this happens generally, doesn't it? Progressive movements get co-opted by official society and organized in the interest of capital. So you have these, we talked about this last week, antagonistic movements against the corporate nature of football clubs and racism in football clubs, often in football fanzines and so on, started by grassroots, often socialist activists, and things like show racism, red card, for example, started off as an initiative of people in the militant tendency, and these things become officialized. We all know about the hyper commodification of football. Mark Fisher, incidentally, was at the FA Cup's semi-final. I forgot when it was, Liverpool versus Nottingham Forest, was it? At Hillsborough, with the Hillsborough disaster. So that had a lasting impression on him. Concepts of collective joy often can also refer to how we cohere together politically, the feeling we get when we're together with others on a joint project that we have involvement on. It can be dancing and so on and so on. And he often brings up themes of like red plenty. So he poses that against notions of growth capitalist growth, capitalist development. And red plenty is where we rationally plan society in favour of human interests. What we decide amounts to human flourishing and so on. He also talked a lot about consciousness raising, looking back at some of the movements in the late 60s and 70s where the working class movement was strong, resulted in all manner of adjuncts to the wider movement, if you like, especially within feminism or women's liberation movement. There was people getting together to talk about their lives. It was a common thing. And I think sometimes on the left we can dismiss this kind of thing as hippie or middle class and all the rest of it. And quite often it is, you know, but there's a case of obviously not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. He also talked a lot about lost futures. So the future that we're going through now of things getting worse, the hyper commodification of everything wasn't inevitable. You know, there were other futures that could have happened with a different twist of the historical dice. He also, his last work, Post-Capitalist Desire, looks at how we can help desires that are existent in society for something beyond the present are there, if latent. And our role, as well as, you know, core organizing, is to foment those kind of political and social desires. As I said, Mark Fisher, born in 1968, committed suicide January 2017, is also known under his blogging alias K-Punk. He was an English writer, he was a music critic, he was a political activist and a cultural theorist, philosopher, and an FE teacher. He initially came to prominence with his K-Punk blog, which looked at music in an interesting way. And he linked all of these themes together. He published several books, others that people might want to look at, publications such as The Wire, in The Wire, New Statesman, and Sight and Sound, and continues to have various associations with different book publishing companies. His writing, as I said, is always coloured by the atmosphere of the end of history moment, the labelling of any one socialist as a dinosaur, a parochialist, and so on. And this has always been the case. The capitalists have always tried to belittle, you know, our concepts as unrealistic, impossible, against the existing order of things. And again, acid communism is about dissolving those concepts within the population at large. I think these concepts are internalized by much of the Marxist left, as I said, you know, and we can ape the rhetoric that's posed against us. You know, we don't want to be seen a certain way. You know, like, for example, I think there was a code of conduct, for example, in the Young Communist League where they have to dress a certain way to look more working class, you know, and I think obviously, you know, the primacy of working class subjectivity doesn't need us to dress in ways that, you know, mimics a constraint. You know, our project has to be linked to freedom in every sense. He poses some as well, because he talks about film, TV, and popular culture, especially in the 60s and 70s, as emerging bridgeheads for the left, coming out of the post-World War II, you know, social democratic settlement, the NHS, housing, the greater ability of working class people to access further education, strengthened the working class organically, in the West at least. And this allowed for certain working class subjects to appear in popular media, and he talked a lot about this. He also talked about things like Girls Aloud or Jungle, the drum and bass, and he posed as well, you know, he posed the question of, if you were around, again at this point, you know, we're at the point in human society, in the modern era, where society is the most equal it's ever been in 1976. Where we go from that to the case where now we're more unequal than at the time of the pharaohs, and this has been politically happening. But if you go at that high, and there's this high point of culture and movement forwards that goes almost in parallel with arguably with the advancement of the working class. And he says, if you look at music, it's a thought experiment from 1970 and go back 25 years to 1958, and the music that comes out of that time and the culture that comes out it's radically different. It radically is something that's difficult, difficult musical forms of people of a previous generation, arguably, to comprehend. If you go from like 1970 to 1995, when he started doing a lot of his writing, you're in, at the height of neoliberalism, at the height of the post Soviet Union collapse, you've got a situation where things don't seem like they've changed so dramatically. Things seem, this covers bands rather than people getting together so much, rehashes of what's gone before, smooth FM, repackaging of the past. He also talked a lot about mental health, and he talked about the privatization of our own mental health. So we have to do enough yoga. I love doing yoga, by the way, but you have to do yoga. You have to do the right, organize yourself as an individual, self-manage, rather than society looking at collective needs and how we're all benefited from that. Capitalist realism, the book argued, and I'll quote from this, that to describe the ideological situation, I said, with the fall of the USSR, he wrote, capitalist realism, as I understand it, is more like a pervasive atmosphere, conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education and acting as a kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action. And as an FE teacher, he noted the transmission of a new capitalist common sense. And he talked himself about management, talked David Brandt type management, often ex or current leftists saying, we don't like this any more than you do. This is what we signed up for, but that's how things are now. And this individualist mindset, enables capitalist realism. It's and it's part of the situation now where some of the automatic collective experiences and traditions are to be reignited, if you like. So he also talked about some of the quotes that come out now when you go for a job interview. You've got to be passionate about making sandwiches. There's the false identifications rather than on class. It's your Starbucks or Costa, and so on. He talks about greenwashing, enabling, and the primacy of market fundamentalism in society. Also, we can talk about this later if you want. There's the issue of accelerationism. So, moving forward the productive forces and dealing with the problem at the end point, and there are left and right-wing variants of that. In Weekly Worker itself, he wrote a book along these lines, which presented a critique of neo-anarchism. And he says, so capitalist realism is a belief, but it's also an attitude related to that belief, an attitude of resignation, defeatism, and depression. Really then, capitalist realism, while it is disseminated by the neoliberal right, very successfully so, is a pathology of the left, or elements of the so-called left, that they succumb to. It was an attitude promoted by New Labour. What was New Labour if not, in fact, imposing the values of capitalist realism? In other words, we resign ourselves to the fact that there is no getting around capital. Capital will ultimately run things, and all we can do is perhaps bolt on a couple of tethers as gestures to social justice. So, again, there's a talk he gave as well. Again, and he poses three movements that absolutely terrified the ruling class in this period of the late 60s to 1976, the militant working classes I've talked about. And the freedoms that workers sought in that period, greater freedom, reduced working hours and control, has been turned into the gig economy and class war from above. The women's movement was absolutely terrifying to the ruling class and has been, transmuted into you can have it all, but you have to work harder. You can have your career, but you need to look after the family as well. Gay liberation goes from something terrifying also to the pink pound. And acid communism, as I said, the book that he was writing before he sadly, tragically actually, killed himself, looked at some of the themes of this period and the interlocking effect of psychedelia as well as both a movement that comes out of these things and colours the imagination and political possibilities for the left. There's a YouTube video called "All of This Is Temporary," which I'd really urge people to see if they get the chance. I mean, you look at him; he looks like a geography teacher. He doesn't look like some kind of new age guru at all. And what he's saying is kind of, to me anyway, came across as like electrifying class war perspective constructed in a new way. He talked about lost futures, and again, the possibility we could have had of the socialist or worker orientated future we could be living is posed again in another series of blogs around boring dystopia. Our so-called choice that we have in the decaying infrastructure of British high streets. The issue of drugs I'll touch on. I mean, you can't use the term acid communism without thinking about acid, mushrooms, psychedelics, and so on. And to have an orientation towards acid communism, if you like, or use that frame, doesn't mean you have to tune in, turn on, and drop out. But like anything else, drugs are part of life, and some of the movements against legalization and so on. But it's more about how the notion of psychedelics dissolving reality, so we can reset, and it's used as a metaphor. There's also themes from ecstasy, the ecstasy movement of the late 80s, and rave culture. There's an interesting academic article, that talks about the decline of ecstasy and the rise of binge drinking. And ecstasy challenges, in so many respects, some of the commodification preferences of the brewing industry, for certain. The ecstasy comes on the scene. A proportion of young people stop using alcohol in the same way. The response from the brewing industry and the conservative governments is to get rid of licensing laws. You have the introduction of alcopops, and the cultivation of a culture of binge drinking, which of course has existed historically, but something where that's the hedonism of choice. That's the letting go of choice, rather than this new movement. And of course we can, and I'll kind of I'll just talk about this, as to end, is, this, I think on the left, certainly on aspects of what I would call the Marxist left in defeat, we have these false equivocations. It's like weirdos do all the cultural stuff, and we just need to get people to meetings and selling papers and all the rest of it. And there's a vast legacy of the working class movement promoting and embedding a sense of collective joy and social organisation. The ILP, the Independent Labour Party in this country, the Clarion Club, the Cycling Club, the Social Democratic Party in Germany had a whole range of social organisation. The Austrian workers' movement had a real effect on town planning and so on. We've spoken at these meetings before about the Workers' Olympics. The Italian Communist Party had the People's Palaces, where offering people a night out at a knockdown rate. Increasingly now, young people don't get the opportunity to go out and dance in the same way. Nightclubs are less frequent. Even festivals are increasingly commodified. There's a link as well with the Italian autonomous movements like Radio Alice, and I think the whole acid communism concept is more familiar within that movement. Farksy himself was a member of the Plan C group. I was going to talk a bit more about the Pitman painters, the agitprop trains during the Russian revolutions, and some of the stuff that even people like the radical anthropology have posed about abstract thinking and looking at human original communism, at what makes us human in a sense of our need for connectivity and solidarity. So I think problems of acid communism, you can have this issue of normies versus avant-garde. So you had the experience in the 1960s of some radical left groups ending up taking, in the US and Japan, taking acid together, thinking that it was going to elevate their consciousness, but just end up driving themselves more into an ultra-left bubble. So we need to have the mass approaches rather than allowing leftists to be ghettoized. And that involves, imaginative thinking, inventive thinking, and taking things from the working class experience itself, such as I've described, and avoiding that kind of ghettoization. Again, some people can hear the word acid communism. There's a misunderstanding in regards of a focus on drugs, which isn't the case. Although acid communism clearly is informed by these things. And I'll finish on another important phrase borrowed from Frederick Jameson that Mark Fisher talked about in noting within capitalist hard realism that it's harder to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. The left we can all consider the present situation with climate change, the narratives we hear about asylum seekers and so on is difficult. But we live in a fast-changing world. The elastic band has been pulled back from 1976 to the situation where we have this grotesque inequality but things can turn into their opposites by their very nature. And learning from our personal and collective defeats, such as the organisers of this forum, is a way that we can enable a process of learning and doing better next time, and actually laying the groundwork for the communist future. And I'll leave it there, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, comrade. Very interesting, different subject, but I'm not an expert on at all. But surely if you look at the left, and I do agree, it is quite dire culturally. Often the culture of the left means you go to the pub or something. That's what you do as culturally, etc. You might review a Ken Loach film, etc., and that's about it. So I quite agree that we have to go much beyond if we want to reach younger people, as well as
I think sometimes the left can be the rear guard rather than the vanguard, sadly.
Yes. Can I ask you a question? We've got a few people with their hands up already, yeah, and we've got another comrade speaking afterwards. So I suggest I bring in the questions first, and then you can come back if that's okay.
One at a time, or
no, it's three.
Oh, right.
Okay. It's not that many. So in terms of his alternative, and it sounds quite good, and collective joy, who's not into that, that sounds good. But how was his vision for actually achieving change beyond, you get together in a commune or something, or he was not a member of any kind of party, as I understand it. What was his idea of how we would change the system and get away from capitalism and towards communism? It's just you have to live it, or do you have to You
No,
overthrow,
I think he was
etc.
in.
Can you, sorry, can we do the replying at the end if that's
Oh, right, sorry, yeah.
so I'll bring in, there's two more questions. Oh, three actually. So if comrades, if you could start your videos. Peter was first, then Ian, and then Victor.
Hi there.
Hi, Peter.
Ah, yeah. Thanks for that, mate. It was interesting. I don't really know that much about Mark Fisher, but you know, his views are interesting. It's probably it reminds me of kind of like, and I've read a little bit around it, so that I take it he's a follower of people like Marcuse and this one-dimensional man, which was a post-war product of the integration of the working class into consumer society and commodification of culture. Hence, there being not much room for to embrace a counter thought to sorry, just putting the dog out. It's a capitalism. So. And you know, so we see that in, or you know, that echoes on what you've mentioned tonight, Colin. I just thought that you know the question probably I want to just ask you is well, it's two. Did he have a kind of understanding of political organization to achieve communism? And more to the point, why did like I understand he had a book out on what he thought of capitalist realism, which he kind of mentioned before about one-dimensional man. And then he had the switch to acid communism. And yeah, capital realism is all about like the kind of subordination of thought to the interest of capital and not thinking beyond the commodification of life as I understand it. And so the obliteration of culture, cultural objects and even art, you know, as well, under the kind of process of commodification and so on, and so the flattening down of thought and more imaginative thought. And then we have this kind of view then that well, no, really, there's space there for acid communism. And I was just wondering where did that come from? Did he, was the class analysis of that? Was the class context for that, for this transformation from kind of deep pessimism towards a relatively more optimistic view? So
okay, actually, Paul, that's two quite big questions already. So maybe you do want to come back now.
Okay, well, the thing about political organization, he was quite pragmatic in his the things he was organizing. Plan C was a group, it still exists actually, quite an interesting group, and there's acid communism kind of partially comes out of that, as does the Notes for Below group, and who do work as inquiry in the gig economy and so on. I think he was in the Labour Party actually, and I think he came into this as a broad leftist, not broad left, saying broad left, broadly speaking, leftist Marxism, and became political in a period that explains his thinking. It's in part in a period where all of these concepts were under attack, and he critiqued things like Occupy and some of the neo-Marxist anti-organizing tendencies. So he was definitely in favor of political organization. And I think towards the end, before he killed himself, the whole point of acid communism was trying to not be so wedded to these boxes. As I said, I'm somebody who believes we need a communist party, but what will the Communist Party look like? How will it function? I think there are questions that need asking. In terms of a strategy for achieving communism, I don't think he concentrated on that. Although, from people I knew who knew him directly, he was on board with a lot of these conversations. And I think some of my own thought thinking is like sometimes we put things in boxes. That's what Marxists do, or this is what anarchists do. And I think there's no problem with encouraging people, for example, Marxists encouraging people to set up affinity groups, as long as we don't fetishize, or assemblies, as long as we don't fetishize these as the form that radical socialists need to use. In terms of what was the other question? Subordination of thought. That's definitely something that he looked on. That's something that's within us all. And I think by negation, that's common on the left. Some of the things I said before, kind of rigid thinking, unable to sort of self-critique, just nothing wrong with party lines, but people not being able to think outside of these. There was also something about, he talked a lot about class in the sense of noticing, with bands, for example, he posed that a lot of bands in the 70s, 80s, 90s even, were able to hone their craft through the benefit system, and now you don't have that. A lot of the bands tend to be from public school or what have you. Did I miss one of the questions, Tina? Help me out here. I might be rambling.
He changed from capitalist realism to acid communism, if there was anything.
Acid communism's not a program, if you like. It's the beginnings, and he's only started to write this, but a flip on capitalist realism. So it's like, this is how we're subordinated in our psychologically, and and the acid communism is like the overcoming of that. I think he was quite open to different strands of thinking without having a blueprint, if you like. Okay. Not a rigid Marxist, not a rigid autonomist, really.
Yep. We've got two more people with their hands up. Ian, please. Hello.
Good evening, comrades. I've been following the Acid Communism website for some time, and I'm constantly intrigued by it. One of the things I'm interested in is the use of Soviet imagery, because there is a problem, isn't there, really? I mean, for a lot of people, when they see the hammer and sickle, they associate it with a regime that was even more murderous than Hitler, in terms of the sheer numbers of people killed. And of course, arguably, Hitler wouldn't have come to power without Stalin's help in the first place. So on the one hand, I've always regarded it as problematic to use Soviet imagery. On the other hand, I think because we always have to explain ourselves, we may as well try to reclaim at least some of the imagery. I wouldn't wish to repudiate the events of October 1917 any more than I would wish to repudiate the actions of the Paris Commune. And so from that point of view, I think in trying to reclaim that imagery, we're having the debate about what the nature of the Soviet Union was. And in a way, it kind of mirrors my own kind of political journey, really. And also the importance that you're stressing about culture, I think, can't be stressed enough. Because, for example, I joined the Young Communist League the day before my 13th birthday. But within a year and a half, it was quite clear that the Soviet Union wasn't entirely as portrayed in the pages of Soviet Weekly, let alone the Morning Star or whatever else. And my response to that really wasn't so much a principled turning my back on communism, but was instead to drift off into the Anti-Nazi League, Rock Against Racism, that kind of thing, because the music and the culture of growing up in London at that time, the whole thing about two-tone. I mean, you might have noticed from the haircut, there was a sort of skinhead kind of background to me as well. The point was about skins in the early years was that they like black music. And so the idea that the right wing should kind of appropriate skinheads or whatever, and because they weren't originally right wing, they liked black music. And what I liked in the Anti-Nazi League, for example, was that you could go to a UB40 gig and there'd be skins down the front giving it "Sieg Heil," but we could just go in there and take over their space. And it was intensely pleasurable. And at a time when, for example, the Communist Party was really an apologist for the nature of the Soviet Union, it seemed preferable and a lot more fun. And that can't be overestimated, I don't think. So just that really is about the use of Soviet imagery and how you feel it fits in, and also this kind of whole business about the sort of sheer joy of of a cultural movement which is also political, like Two Tone was, or Scar.
Oh,
Soviet imagery. I mean, I don't want people to think that acid communism is just like a homage to Lev Brezhnev's and the late Soviet bureaucrats. I think there is a legacy, like you said yourself. We get this stuff thrown at us, so we should interrogate it for it on its own merits. I think from the beginning, the Soviet Union started to degenerate, and as today, we think of the Labour Party as a bourgeois or capitalist workers' party. The working class pole, if you like, it's very much diminished. And I would have a position personally that that's the same with the Soviet and experience, the experience of the official communism. There were cultural forms, they were interesting. There were enduring cultural forms that and attitudes towards art that could be defended within a system that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise defend. And I think that's to be defended. I think, acid communism, also the use of images. I think sometimes we have a very much major chord. What I try and do is in acid communism is provoke discussion. So sometimes you could have some kind of bizarre image, some psychedelic image next to something else that encourages us to think in a certain way. And we post Soviet imagery, among lots of other things, to interrogate it, to look at what we keep, what we discard. But it's part of our heritage, if you like, for good or bad. We need to look back as well as look forward. So it's very much like a blue sky thinking, as well as interrogation of the workers' movement, what it means, what it can be. If that makes sense, Tina. And
it does. I think it's also it's interesting perhaps that we're now far away from the end of the Soviet Union to actually look at communism in a different way and to go beyond to the yes or no Stalin. There's a bit of a discussion in the chat, which we can't go into it now. But I think there's now a possibility to look at communism in a totally different way, and link it with drugs, etc., which possibly wasn't possible in the 90s, perhaps.
No, I mean, one of the things, like some of the images that we've used hammer and sickle images that instead of being red have got like sort of psychedelic color design, just very basic images like that, especially if it's linked to other articles, does get people talking about stuff. And sometimes, and this is the feature of the online space, you get raids from ultra-right fascist groups, and this provokes other people new to politics to engage in a dialogue. Some of it's mental, to be honest with you, and we can't always keep up with it. But it's an engagement, and it's a learning, it's a platform as well as nice pictures and memes and articles and other things.
Thank you, comrade. That was a interesting first session. I think it's definitely worth thinking about, that we combine the two. We need to go get organized in a party. I quite agree, but we also need to reach out perhaps and reach people who wouldn't see themselves as ready quite to join a party yet. Thank you very much, Paul. It was an interesting session. We're now moving on to the second part with Comrade Agnes Corey. This is a session which I've entitled "Why We Shouldn't Be Reversed Snobs About Opera," because I have come across that a lot on the left, actually, that opera is that's for posh people, and it is expensive to go to the opera, etc. But that I don't think is the main reason many working class people perhaps don't do it. It tends to be seen as quite a posh and nothing to do with me, when it was quite different in the past and was quite a working class time, leisure time to go to the opera and experience that. So very pleased to have with us Agnes Corey, who's the founder director of Bela Bartok Center for Musicianship, and she's actually got a PhD in musicology. So thank you very much for joining us, Agnes. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Just a couple of comments before I start my presentation. I was interested to hear that Mark Fisher was a music critic, because although I didn't tell you, Tina, I am a very enthusiastic and committed voluntary music critic. I've been doing that since 2006. The other thing which struck me as interesting, that I think Paul quoted someone, I'm not sure whom, that it's easier to imagine the end of world than the end of capitalism. So that's very interesting, because at the end of my presentation, which is going to be my last music example, we're going to see either the end of world or end of capitalism, and it's going to be up to you to decide which one it is. So now I'm so sorry, but I need to put on my light because it turned really, oh, that is it.
Good t-shirt.
Ah.
Is your light broken? Oh.
Okay, so does this bother anybody?
No, good. It's good. Yeah.
Because otherwise I can't see my text. So thank you so much. Now, this title, Why Socialists Shouldn't Be Reverse Snobs About the Opera, it doesn't come from me. I was surprised to see that there could be a presentation on such a topic. As I am passionate about music, including opera, as well as about socialism and politics in general, I volunteered to put forward my ideas. So, to avoid any misunderstanding, I am a lifelong socialist and a lifelong passionate opera and music lover. Admittedly, opera is an expensive genre, so attending opera performances is a lot easier for moneyed people than for those struggling to survive. Also, to a large degree, opera attendance is often a manifestation of riches, that is, meeting of the mighty. Many of the rich and powerful attend to be seen rather than for any musical and theatrical interest. However, in most opera houses there are, at least there used to be, very cheap places for those willing to stand or be placed on the top floor of the auditorium. Until 20 years ago, I stood through many performances of even particularly long operas at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. I should add that in my childhood and teenage years in communist Hungary, opera and concert tickets were very cheap for any income, as were also books and other manifestations of culture. In Europe, the genre of opera was created in the late 16th century in Florence by a small group of artists, statesmen, writers, and musicians known as the Florentine Camerata. Their understanding of the probably powerful role of music in Greek tragedy inspired these late 16th century Florentine intellectuals to establish the genre of opera. They decided to recreate the storytelling of Greek drama through music. However, genres of musical drama were cultivated long before the 16th century in Japan, China, and South Asia. The first European opera we know about was Paris Daphne, composed in 1597, while the first surviving European opera was Paris Eurydice of 1600. 1600. However, the first universally appreciated opera was Orfeo by the astonishing great composer Monteverdi. Orfeo was written for and performed for an exclusive audience at the Duke of Mantua's court, where Monteverdi was employed in 1607. However, 30 years after Orfeo, the first public opera house was opened in Venice, thus bringing opera to a much wider audience. It was here, at the Teatro San Cassiano, that Monteverdi's Coronation of Poppea was performed during the Carnival in 1643. Opera plots deal with ancient Greek heroes, gods, kings, queens, and so on. But they also deal with the struggle between upper and lower classes, the oppressor and the oppressed, the devastation of poverty, and the corrupting influence of undue riches and power. And they also portray tensions and tragedies within rural and urban communities of various kinds. Apart from Wagner, who himself wrote the libretti of most of his operas, opera composers set their music to other people's lyrics. However, composers do have the freedom to choose or accept texts, and, crucially, they have the power to manipulate music as they wish. There are a great many operatic examples which should encourage socialists to investigate and hopefully enjoy. An early example is the three-act Beggar's Opera, an operatic satire written in 1728 by John Gay, with music arranged by Johann Christoph Pepusch. This operatic satire was adapted and premiered 200 years later in 1928 as the threepenny opera, the Dreigroschen Oper, with text by Bertolt Brecht and music by Kurt Weill. There are several operas which deserve socialist attention. Bizet's Carmen, 1875, delves into the lives and loves of factory workers, soldiers, robbers, muggers, and the like. However, primarily, this is an outsider opera with Carmen trying to escape from the monotony of working life in a cigarette factory. Puccini shows Party in La Bohème, 1896, an emotional exploitation by a representative of American imperialism in Madama Butterfly, 1904, while in the Rijksprogress, 1951, based on William Hogarth's engravings of 1730-33, librettist Oden and composer Stravinsky portray corruption and destruction caused by riches. We should further consider operas by, for instance, Janacek, Berg, Britten, and others. But let me provide some examples by Mozart, Beethoven, and Wagner. The character of servant Figaro was created by Beaumarchais for his Figaro trilogy. The first of the three plays was The Barber of Seville, 1775, which was the basis of Rossini's opera Il Barbiere di Siviglia, 1816. The second of Beaumarchais' trilogy was The Marriage of Figaro. Written in 1778, just years before the French Revolution, the play reflected the growing dissatisfaction with the ruling class and was considered scandalous at the time, both due to its depiction of incompetent and hedonistic noblemen being outwitted by his servant. Lorenzo da Ponte, Mozart's librettist for the operatic version of 1786, apparently toned down the political passages of the play, but Mozart's music leaves no doubt about the moral context. Interestingly, the roles of master and servant, that is the Count and Figaro, are both written for baritone voices, while the roles for the other pair, the Countess and her servant Susanna, are both for soprano voices. The latter duet, from Act 3, Scene 10 of Marriage of Figaro, allocates similar musical lines to both soprano roles, thus implying full equality between them. Tina, can we please have the latter aria? Thank you, Tina. This example comes from the Metropolitan Opera House, New York, and I really do think that there was no question here that the Countess and the servant were totally equal. Now Beethoven. Beethoven's Fidelio, 1805, originally titled Leonore oder Der Triumph der ehelichen Liebe, had the input of 5 librettists, inspired on a supposedly real incident during the French Revolution. In 1789, Bouillot wrote the French text Leonora, and I can't pronounce the rest. Joseph Sonnleiter made a German translation. Emanuel Schikaneder commissioned the opera in 1803, and Beethoven's friend Stefan from Browning contributed to the text, and George Friedrich Reitke made the final version. The plot is about a heroic wife rescuing her unjustly imprisoned husband. Hopefully, one day, someone will write an opera about Stella and Julian Assange as well. But Beethoven's sympathy with the oppressed goes beyond the unjustly imprisoned husband. The prisoner chorus is a moving musical realization of the horror of being kept in dark prison cells and the longing for light and justice. The Beethoven example, Tina, please. Thank you so much, Tina. This example came from a performance of the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. And now to Wagner. Wagner's monumental Ring cycle is arguably about the evils of capitalism, which destroys the world. Loosely based on characters from Germanic heroic legends, such as the Nibelungenlied, Wagner created the huge cycle, including text, music, and dramatic instructions, by himself. In addition, he also organized the building of a special opera house, that is, the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth, for the project. At the beginning of The Ring of the Nibelung, written between 1869 and 1876, the dwarf Alberich steals the mermaid's hoard of gold, and from some of it makes a powerful ring, which rules all the world. When the god Wotan steals the ring from Alberich, the dwarf puts a curse on it. During the 4-opera cycle, lasting some 15 hours, there is plenty of love, intrigue, and greed. But arguably, the most powerful thread throughout is the pursuit of the powerful ring, which causes all owners, whether gods, giants, dwarves, or humans, to die. The cycle concludes with Brunhilde, the last owner, returning the ring to the Rhine maidens, the mermaids, and setting fire to the world, thus ending capitalism. Before we listen to the concluding immolation scene, or part of it, where Brunhilde sets her world to fire and returns the gold to nature, I would like to draw attention to Bernard Shaw's The Perfect Wagnerite. The 4th edition was published in 1929, but it was very successful, and there were several editions in 1898, 1902, 1913, 1923, and then reprint in 1926 and 1929. In his 155-page book, Shaw provides detailed analysis of Wagner's Ring and leads it back to Wagner's revolutionary ideas of 1848. Shaw proposes that the picture portrayed in Alberich's kingdom is unregulated industrial capitalism as described by Engels. Shaw comments that although Wagner uses stagecraft by making Alberich's initial curse important, it is not necessary, it's not needed, because, quote, the ruin to which the pursuit of riches leads needs no curse to explain it. So now let's listen to, well, not the whole of immolation scene, because that's 14 minutes, but the last 7 minutes of this immolation scene.
Thank you, Agnes. Are you is that the end of your introduction?
That's the end, yeah.
Sorry.
I wanted to keep it to what was the original scheduled timing, and
Yes.
before anybody asks any questions, or if anybody wants to do that, can I just say, Tina, that I'm kind of bursting into tears now, because this is the first time ever, after about 20-25 Zoom presentations, that my music examples went the way I dreamt about. And that's because of you. And I just can't get over it. So thank you so much.
I'm glad it worked all right. Great. I'm really happy. It was quite the finale, isn't it? It's very moving when they all turn around to the audience, doesn't it? And when that works with the music, brilliant. Really, really good. So, comrades, if you have any questions, contributions, and hopefully those who know more about opera than me could come in and ask though. But in terms of, you know, as a socialist and a Marxist, where do you see, if you see it at all, where do you see the interlinking of, you know, I mean, I can see lots of collectivity, and I think that there's a lot of that happening in opera, isn't it? Where it's sort of, you have the people working together to sing, and you have a sort of sense of solidarity through the singing, and through, even when it clashes, sometimes it comes together again and it goes apart, etc. Where is it for you, the sort of key, you know, as a socialist, why are you drawn to opera, you think?
Yeah, I'm going to answer in a second. It's just I forgot to mention that, as someone, I think someone called Jane, mentioned in the chat just when I finished my text. Yes, the last example was Gwyneth Jones, and it was from Bayreuth. So I should have mentioned. So where do I see it? Well, as I was trying to explain in my prepared presentation, there are so many ways one can express the frustration about politics and life and struggle and injustice. And one is opera. And it goes, when it's done well, it goes deep into the heart and the stomach and so on. So sometimes I think that the best way to express all the horrors we live in is through music. It cannot be misunderstood. And yes, it's very much a communal thing. It's very much teamwork. Um, but that's not the main reason why I think that we should go for it and we should cultivate it. And I've been encouraging my pupils over the decades to go to opera, but I didn't just encourage them. I pressurized the Royal Opera House management, ENO management, that they should give us free tickets because it's their duty, because it's the future, and these children can't afford to come. And kind of I always managed, because then we see all everything which matters in life, including politics, expressed via music, and everybody should have the right to go and hear it.
Absolutely, very well put. It is about human nature, isn't it? The human experience. It's in
Yes.
all its forms. Okay, Malcolm, please. You need to unmute, comrade. Sorry, you're not quite unmuted.
Okay.
That's it.
I want to say something that's completely against what's being talked about. I would like the speaker's view on the idea that what people call maybe serious or classical music is basically a very oppressive music. And this is because it's based on a diatonic scale. And the diatonic scale allows you to play all sorts of music, but it actually restricts people. So what I'm holding up here, if you can see it, is a blues harp. A blues harp comes in keys. This one is in the key of C. So you can't play a blues harp in the wrong key. So most folk music, which is much more available to people than so-called classical music or learning those sorts of instruments, is much more accessible because it has much more restricted scales. And this is true, I think, of most folk music. The other thing I wanted to say about the oppressive nature so I mean, everybody who is a sort of virtuoso has spent all their life practicing and practicing and practicing, and being a virtuoso is completely unavailable. Even playing a musical instrument with any competence is more or less unavailable to everybody. And if you ask people, say, can you sing? Almost everyone will say, no, I've got a terrible voice. Whereas in fact, it's nature from sort of way back that everybody does sing. The other thing I wanted to mention is the dictatorship of trying to comply with the composer's exact orders. So pieces of music are constantly examined as to what the original composer actually meant and how it should be played. And so there's no freedom whatsoever in so-called serious or classical music for musicians to do anything except to follow orders of the dictator who is the composer. Thank you.
Controversial comments right from the start. I like it. Agnes, do you have anything to answer to that?
Oh yeah, definitely. There is no, I mean, you have the freedom to listen or not to listen, so there is no dictatorship.
Not the point. No.
That's one thing. But also, I did mention right at the beginning that operas, music theater were already happening long before the 16th century in China and Japan and South Asia. And there, the music is not tonal system. It's all kind of scales and so on. But, you know, I only had not one presentations to make, and I wanted to focus on Mozart and Beethoven and Wagner because of the actual plot, which I think should appeal to socialists. Yes, singing is the beginning of everything. I teach everything through singing. I fully agree. So, and how you read the music, which is on the paper, depends on from artist to artist. One of the things which I'm trying to teach to my pupils is that now let's look what's not written, what is between the notes. So this is where interpretation comes in. So you have a certain amount of freedom. Anyway, that's my response. Is that okay for you? No?
Sorry, Mark,
Not-
do you think she's answered your questions? Sorry, you're still muted. Sorry, Comrade.
Not really, because my experience of music over many, many years is that, I mean, I once had asked a piano teacher, I said to her, have you ever heard anybody play for you that was correct? Because most music teachers I've ever had have always, that's wrong. Haven't you seen what the music says? It says double P, you're playing MF and whatever. And so that it's endlessly critical in that sense, and you're always trying to achieve some sort of impossible level of achievement, which sort of almost nobody does. And the other thing well, as I'm allowed to talk, which is very kind of you, what do you think about jazz, for instance?
Jazz?
Yes.
Wonderful. You've got the freedom there. And I'm so proud to tell you that one of my ex-students who studied with me for like about 8 years when a child is one of the best jazz bass players now. And he says everything he knows is from me. So yes, wonderful. But this presentation was about opera.
I know I'm going way off subject.
Yeah, jazz is a great genre.
Apologize.
Great genre, full of freedom, improvisation on some sets. But yes,
okay.
I was not trying to persuade comrades that opera has a lot to offer to socialists.
I do wonder if we could in future, discuss a session on atonal and tonal music and stuff, which I'm a total novice about, but I've heard bits of it, and I find it very interesting. Malcolm, if you are interested and expert enough on that, it might be good to have two different views and putting forward examples, etc.
I teach atonal but this presentation was about opera.
Well,
Okay.
okay, interesting. Well, we'll revisit that because that communists, socialists should talk about everything. We should be, champions of all questions. Jane, hi. Can you unmute? Yeah,
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah. Hi.
Good. Well, yes, I am indeed the chair who sent the chat about Gwyneth Jones in Sherrow's room, which, do you realise that was actually nearly 50 years ago? It's controversial, it was at the time, it's now become a classic. Now, you see, what I did this evening, I actually stopped listening to the live broadcast of Tristan and Isolde from Bayreuth so that I could participate in this discussion. You see, I got slightly sidetracked by what Malcolm said, because I also love folk music, and there are occasions where I have it very difficult to decide whether I'm going to go to a folk club or the Wigmore Hall. Anyway, it's not relevant, but you see, the thing is that there's, although there doesn't seem to be an immediate kind of link between opera and folk music, what there is a link is between folk music and early music, and there's a bit of a sort of overlap, because a lot of folk singers like Shirley Collins also perform early music. Anyway, so I just wanted to say that, you see, I take your point about that there are people who do go to opera to see and be seen, and this is sort of like, to some extent, the case at the Royal Opera House. It was never been the case at English National Opera or outside London or in Scotland. And one of the things that I don't live in London anymore, but one of the things I miss is all of these weird theatres in Hackney and Islington, where you have sort of semi-professional companies doing new works. Harrison Burtwell is sadly no longer with us, but his work would actually sell out at places like the Almeida Theatre. Now, there is a problem with, Glyndebourne, for instance. I've never actually been to Glyndebourne, but there are a lot of people who go there for the social cachet and not for the music. I do appreciate that. And I must admit that sometimes at the Royal Opera House, I felt like shouting at people, "Now listen, everybody, I live in a council flat in Kilburn," but that might have resulted in me being escorted from the building by security. But I mean, I was sort of, when I first started going to the opera, I was 13 and I wasn't aware of the sorts of social nuances. I went to the opera because I liked opera. And it's expensive, but you sort of factor it in, I suppose. Anyway, I did really think that's fascinating, and it was really lovely to see that scene again from The Ring. And I mean, I just think how brilliantly Sherrow interpreted it. And yeah, I'll just finish by saying I love opera, I love folk music, I love jazz. Anyway, so thanks very much for your talk. And I did find that what Malcolm said was slightly distracting, so I got a bit sidetracked. Anyway, I think I finished for now.
Thank you. Can I just ask you, did you say you were sidetracked because you were also listening to Tristan and Isolde from Bayreuth?
Yes, this is a live live relay of Tristan from Bayreuth now.
I know, it's happening now. I know.
Yeah, right now. And I actually switched it off so I could come participate in this discussion.
I forgive you, because the conductor, Semyon Bichkov, is great, and I'm sure it's a great performance.
I mean, it was just so wonderful what I did. I was listening to the radio broadcast rather than the live stream, because I couldn't actually access the live stream. But I was very happy to be able to hear it. And I think when this is over, I probably will hear the last sort of 15 minutes or so.
Yeah, thank you very much for fitting in my talk, and at the same time when Semyon Bichkov contacts Tristan and Isolde, which I'm sure is wonderful. But there is nothing one could say about socialism, I'm afraid. Okay.
Okay. Like all genres, some are linked to socialism, aren't they, and some aren't. This is actually just in the chat. What do you think about that? Is there something like highest form of music, a best form, or is it just purely subjective? Do you think whoever likes whatever music, pop has the same value as opera for you?
Well, I think any genre is fine if it's done well. For me, that's the criteria. But again, today my task was to persuade comrades that opera can see an awful lot about the issues which we discuss on our weekly meetings, at our weekly meetings, i.e. about life and oppressors and justice and poverty. So that's what I was trying to put forward today, that it's not opera's fault if it's hijacked by the very rich. Opera still gives us the chance to see, how poor people were in La Boheme and what that American Pinkerton did in Madame Butterfly. So, imperialism, poverty, it's all there in opera.
Yeah, thank you. Ken?
Very many thanks, Agnes, for your talk, which was fascinating and a great reminder of many great operas that I've seen and listened to over the years. One composer you didn't mention in your talk, and I appreciate that within the constraints of the time provided, you can't cover everything, was Verdi in Italy. And I'd be interested in your views on his politics, both before the 1848 revolution, which was, of course, defeated, when his operas were more overtly political, and his operas after then, which became much less obviously political. But certainly in operas like Rigoletto, the oppression of the ruler is very much to the fore. And I just wondered what your own perceptions and reflections on Verdi's operas from the point of view of politics would be. Thank you.
Well, I'm not a Verdi expert, but I think that most of his operas deal with people in courts. And I was trying to do examples where, in spite of being, like the Count and Countess's household and so on, but I was trying to show the equality or not equality between servants and the aristocrats and that sort of thing. But I mean, for instance, you mentioned Rigoletto. It is all in the Duke's household. It happens in the Duke's household. And yes, he is a horrible person, but I don't see the socialist context there. So forgive me if I'm wrong. I know Rigoletto very well, but I wouldn't be able to present it as an example of socialist issues. That's what I'm saying. There's a lot of freedom fighting, and apparently Nabucco, even already Nabucco, was supposed to be like a later time, so the freedom from the oppressor nationalistically, and then one nation occupies the other nation. I think there's a lot of that in Verdi. I'm just thinking about, I mean, Don Carlos, again, I mean, my favorite Verdi opera is Don Carlos, but it's all about the king and the queen. And so I don't know, what do you think, Ian?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, you're right. Most of Verdi's operas are written from the perspective of people, the Italians, struggling for independence.
Yes.
But I think there's also a very strong commentary on the extent to which aristocratic government oppresses people, distorts society, and makes ordinary living impossible. So, yes, he's less, if you like, overtly socialist than some of the other works we've described, but in his own time, what he was writing against, I would argue, was the system of oppression that was inflicted on the Italian people at the time, and ways potentially in which you might fight against it. So it's perhaps a more distant relation, but I still think there is a relevance to Verdi's work. But that perhaps is the subject for a separate talk. But thank you.
I'm very happy to put together something about Verdi. And I went for the examples which were immediately in my mind when I saw the title about snobism and socialists. But you are absolutely right. But there was a time limit, and I wanted to have a good balance of talk and music, and I wanted to have good music. I wanted to have the best possible performances which I could find. And yes, you are absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, you have to come again, Agnes, don't you? Thank you, Ken. Well, it's also, I think it's good to see, comrades like Ken, he listens to Verdi and he thinks of those liberation movements, etc. So it is, everybody takes from whoever composer they want, they take the good message, perhaps, what is progressive about it. Sally, hi.
Hi, am I on mute or can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you, yeah.
Thank you, Agnes. It was lovely to hear your thoughts on those great operas. But I just wanted to pick you up on what you said at the beginning about the accessibility. And I've just been in Birmingham for Birmingham Opera, who were doing New Year by Michael Tippett, his last opera, which is a socialist opera, like most of his operas. He was a socialist. And it's done in a big tent, and it's with a completely amateur orchestra. And I don't care what Malcolm, whoever he is, says, you don't have to sing exactly what's there. None of the people in that chorus had vocal scores. Most of them can't read music. Most of them have not done any singing before, but they learn these complex operas, not just Tippett, but Hovanshina, Lady Macbeth of the Macbeth District, huge Verdi operas, and they do them from memory, and they sing them from the heart. And the audience, it's not in a prosarch, it's in a tent or a factory. And they've done Fidelio, a wonderful production of Fidelio. And it doesn't have to be, opera doesn't have to be inaccessible. And indeed, Michael Tippett would have absolutely loved this New Year. He would have loved it to be out of the opera house. And I just wanted to, also I thought you might end actually with Ligeti and Le Grand Macabre, which is indeed the end of the world. And also a very interesting composer, Hungarian composer.
I know. Yes.
Anyway, nice to hear you, Agnes. And thank you.
Thank you so much for Sally. And I don't know if Ian can still hear me, that now that he mentioned Verdi, all of a sudden the Don Carlos music is in my head when the Grand Inquisitor comes and squashes all the revolutionary people, because there's a bit of a revolution in there. And then he comes in and on your knees, but it's a bass singer who sings it. And everybody's frightened and they are back and they are oppressed. So all of a sudden now all these Wagner scenes come to my mind. But I'm so glad I didn't think of them while I was preparing, because then I wouldn't have known how to fit it in all in the available time.
The other great thing is with Verdi is you can sing the tunes. That's a very leveling thing, that everybody can sing those tunes. Everybody.
I can see a session on Verdi coming up. Thank you, Sally.
And I won't be able to sleep because that you on your knees, on your knees. Oh.
Agnes, can I ask you about sort of the artist and the music, because you made an attempt to look for socialism within those operas, or socialistic ideas, etc. And I appreciate that, but there is a sort of a long-standing discussion, of course, sort of can controversial, or say artists with bad politics, can they make good art that you can look at without thinking about the politics of the author? And Wagner is a very good example. I mean, he's highly controversial, as I'm sure you know. I mean, you mentioned he was sort of a supporter of the revolutionary upheavals. He had to flee Germany because he was a supporter of that. But then he also was quite the anti-Semite. He wrote quite a lot of stuff against Jewish people, etc. Hitler incorporated him, etc. He was that was a big thing, that Wagner was incorporated by Hitler. How do you see those sort of tensions that politicians get incorporated, and they're not always nice people, but they can still make nice art, perhaps?
Yeah, unfortunately, the very, very bad people very bad human beings can still create great art. But I'm just going to immediately respond to this Wagner and anti-Semitism. First of all, it's not, I mean, it's my view. It's controversial, but this is my view. it's not Wagner's fault that Hitler decided to love Wagner's music. And yes, Wagner did write some not very nice things about Jewish people, but I think he was an armchair anti-Semite. I mean, the person who premiered the Wagner's Parsifal was Hermann Levy, a Jewish conductor. And Wagner asked him to do that. Wagner has chosen Hermann Levy. And Hermann Levy lived in Wagner's house for several weeks when they were preparing it. And Parsifal is the ultimate thing. It's all about Christianity and the Aryan people and all that. But in spite of that, it was Hermann Levy who was chosen to conduct. And Hermann Levy also conducted performances of The Ring. So I'm Jewish, I'm a Holocaust survivor, and I just love Wagner's music.
People are complex.
Yeah.
And anti-Semitism at that time was so common. It wasn't just a Nazi thing, was it? Yeah.
And he never suggested that let's have some genocide of whether Jews or Palestinians. He was just making nasty comments in his writing. Now, I wish he wouldn't have done it, but also probably he was a bit jealous because of Meyerbeer was very successful and this sort of thing. So no, I wish he wouldn't have done it. And no, he wasn't a very pleasant person. And in spite of this anti-capitalist piece, this monumental ring cycle, he was a very happy capitalist. He lived very well, and he exploited Ludwig, whatever his name was, the king of Bavaria. And so he was a complex character. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, I think that's what humans are, aren't we? we all live in capitalism for a start. That makes us as socialists quite complicated and have to have a bourgeois job, etc. Ian.
Oh, thank you so much, Agnes. Absolutely brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I mean, in coming as I did from a sort of London working class background, the idea of going to opera as a boy wouldn't have crossed my mind. When I went to university, I remember one of my lecturers sort of saying about how Mozart despised the aristocracy, and this comes across in his operas all the time. And the idea that opera could have this radical content didn't cross my mind until I went to university, and then it opened up a whole new world, really. The other thing about opera, which I've grown to love, is its enormous flexibility and its capacity to reinvent itself in different ways. I became very fond of John Gay's Beggar's Opera, and I have a number of different versions of that opera. And here you have the most biting political satire of the day. I mean, there are characters in there. So, for example, at one point, Peachum talks about Bob Booty. Now, everyone in the audience at that time would have known that Bob Booty that was being referred to was the current Prime Minister of the day, Robert Walpole, who was known to be somebody who accepted bribes from the most criminal people going. And the whole story is about how the rich get away with it and the poor get punished for really quite minor offences. And so it ties in with my love of the artist Hogarth as well. The other thing about it, I mean, the way in which it can even be reinvented in a contemporary milieu. So the rock opera Tommy and Quadrophenia by The Who, I've had a lifelong love of as well. It's not that I'm suggesting that one genre is better than another, but I do think there is some value in having great art that can work on a whole range of different levels. Of course, the other thing about opera is the way in which it can adapt what else is out there. So the number of great operas that have been derived from Shakespeare plays, for example. I think it's a fantastic feature of the genre. So but thank you very much. It's been a fabulous evening, and just that really.
Gosh, I'm so honored because I've been listening to you week after week after week after week. And so from you, a praise is like this is the second time I'm going to burst into tears. Just going back very quickly, yes, the Beggar's Opera, and you say opera can be reinvented. As I mentioned in my presentation, Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill did reinvent the Beggar's Opera of John Gray, and it became the Threepenny Opera or Dreigroschen Opera. So yes, it can be reinvented. The music basically came from folk music in the Beggar's Opera. So Kurt Weill then did his bit, and that was the modern version of the Beggar's Opera. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, comrades. Thank you very much, Agnes. We have no more comments, but it is almost 9 o'clock. So thank you very much. I think though, I mean, if you're up for it, I think you have so much knowledge on these various issues. It would be great if you have any other suggestions for other sessions after our summer break in September. I would be very pleased to have you back on
Wow.
show with sessions.
Thank you. And by the way, thank you for giving me this opportunity, which only came up because when I saw this sentence, socialist snobs opera, I thought, what?
It came about somebody was planning a session and then had to drop out, and you said, yeah, I'm interested in doing it. So
yeah, because I wanted to object.
Good. And you did very well as well. So thank you very much, comrade, bringing us in contact with an area of music that not all socialists are au fait with those. Thank you very much, comrade. And we're hoping to have more of you soon. Comrades, thank you for an interesting discussion and an interesting night on two subjects that I knew very little about, so I consider myself much better informed than I was at the beginning of the evening. Thank you, Agnes. Thank you, Paul. Good night, comrades.
Thank you so much.
We'll be
Goodbye.
back in September. As I said, we have a few weeks off in August. Enjoy your holiday, or if you're going away, enjoy your summer break, and we'll see you back in September. Good night, comrades.
Thank you so much.